When you have a hot property, it must be tempting to be precious with it, which is a shame, as those that dare and succeed are their own biggest reward. These aren't baby steps forward so much as they are massive jumps. I'm Si for WhatCulture.com, and here are 10 big leaps between video game sequels. Number 10, Half-Life 1998 to Half-Life 2 2004. The original Half-Life is considered a milestone for first-person shooters. Its focus on narrative knocked down the boundaries of what was expected from the genre, creating the most immersive FPS up until that point. Which is why it's incredible that Half-Life 2 put some things about the first game in stark contrast by innovating even further. It established more of the world for the series outside of the Black Mesa research facility, giving the franchise an edgier tone that was able to ask grander and more philosophical questions about evolution and fate. In fact, grander is a good catch-all term for what Half-Life 2 did. Instead of being a sci-fi corridor shooter, it allowed players to explore large, uninterrupted environments, go off the beaten path, and via a number of vehicles, traverse some really impressive, grimy scenery. Of course, one huge improvement over the original was the depth of gameplay content. The brand new Havoc physics engine made the game a sandbox in and of itself, and the likes of the game's gravity gun gave players some incredibly fun tools to take full advantage of it. It's pretty remarkable that both games have been in the conversation for the best of all time, especially considering the leaps and bounds Half-Life 2 makes from its predecessor. Number 9, Jak and Daxter 2001 to Jak 2 2003. Capable of displaying at 480p and 16:9, Jak 2 is part of an elite crew of PlayStation 2 games that squeezed more out of the console in this way. Whilst the first game was plenty pretty, this push in the sequel is shown in the great texture work, lighting, and number of enemies on screen at once. But Jak 2's place on this list isn't about its graphics so much as the leap it made stylistically. Jak and Daxter: The Precursor Legacy released in 2001, in the months following the unmatched sea change that was Grand Theft Auto 3's release. Whilst the game is considered a cult hit, it struggled to find its audience at a time when gaming was changing. Of course, GTA would have been a great pick for this list if it wasn't so painfully obvious, but it isn't facetious to say that the impact that game had on the industry came full circle for Naughty Dog when approaching Jak 2. Whilst the platforming and collectathon elements are still present, the sequel takes its heroes in a darker direction, giving them firearms, letting them cuss more frequently, and following a more mature story. It was a divisive choice to be sure, as nobody saw it coming, but it certainly stopped the fledgling franchise from being left in the dust of the industry's change. Number 8, Red Steel 2006 to Red Steel 2 2010. Remember Red Steel? Most people seem to have forgotten, so subscribe to the channel if you like people bringing up weird games like this. Red Steel was a logical launch title for the Nintendo Wii. Set in the Japanese criminal underworld of America, the game was about cutting down enemies with a sidearm and a katana by using the console's motion controls. Unfortunately, its concept perhaps oversold its execution. Many critics and gamers found the game to be awkward to play at times, with the best sword moves poorly, if at all, explained, and the graphics leaving a lot to be desired. So it's kind of incredible that it got a sequel at all, and in fact, that Red Steel 2 might be one of the best games on the system when it comes to utilising its strengths. The original's Metacritic score of 63 compared to 80 for the sequel is a good place to start. Red Steel 2 ditches the modern day setting for a really stylish samurai cowboy aesthetic. Its cel-shaded graphics mean that it's aged remarkably well. Most importantly, with the arrival of the Wii Motion Plus and the failings of the first game to learn from, Ubisoft Paris were able to craft a, what they called, first-person brawler, which is exceedingly rewarding to learn and execute. Whilst the game might be heavy on the tutorials at first, it's worth it to understand and appreciate the combat of this sequel, which finally reaches the promises of the original. Number 7, Street Fighter 1987 to Street Fighter 2 1991. If there's ever been a series that has tried its best to make you forget about its awkward first entry, it's Street Fighter. Most people basically treat the franchise as starting from Street Fighter 2 and its many revisions, and for very good reason. The original Street Fighter might have made plenty of money in the arcade, but it was very flawed. Its control system was a mess, the sole playable character moved horribly slowly, and sprite work was all over the place in quality. It had a spark of potential, being the first game to include variable strengths for punches and kicks, as well as hidden special moves, but it now lives in a huge shadow. Street Fighter 2, which arrived 4 years later, outdid the original game in every way. Combat was tight, fluid, and infinitely more satisfying. It took the original's worldwide tournament concept where it needed to go by including a variety of fighters from all over the globe. The artwork and character designs were stunning, introducing players to the most enduring renditions of some of the most iconic characters in gaming. More than anything, the shine to perfection execution of Street Fighter 2 is responsible for the beginning of the fighting genre boom in a way that the first game could never be. Number 6, Metal Gear Solid 1998 to Metal Gear Solid 2 2001. No video game better displayed the leap from the 5th to 6th generation consoles than Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty. In 1998, the first Metal Gear Solid game helped to turn the original PlayStation on its head. Games from the system's first year like Tekken, Jumping Flash and Gex could never have foreseen what some developers would squeeze out of the console in just a few short years. Kojima's MGS was one of these, using brilliant art direction and choreography to make something unforgettably cinematic out of the PS1's sharp polygons. But MGS2 was another story entirely, continuing the series' habit of cutting-edge thinking just 3 years later on the PlayStation 2. Its use of motion blur and depth of field were unprecedented. Shiny surfaces actually appeared to be reflective. Rain effects from the game's opening actually bounced off the ground and off of the player. Character models didn't just finally have eyes, they were actually incredibly expressive. Sons of Liberty seemed to laugh in the face of the mere idea of limitation. This was 1 year into the PlayStation 2's lifespan, and the game would spend the rest of the generation and the decades following it being rightfully praised as one of the most remarkable titles on the console. Number 5, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis 1999 to Resident Evil 4 2005. The difference between Resident Evil 3 Nemesis and Resident Evil 4 is so huge that presented to a non-gamer it wouldn't be surprising if they assumed they were totally unrelated. Now that's not to say that there weren't Resi games in the 6-year gap between the 3rd and 4th numbered entries. The 2000s was one of the busiest and most experimental times for the series, with Capcom releasing side games, spin-offs and a remake. Even so, people were hungry for the next mainline game that would push the series forward after the destruction of Raccoon City. However, people were not expecting the gigantic jump that Resident Evil 4 would bring in absolutely every way. Its story is completely separate from the rest of the series, going so far as to wrap up the fate of the malevolent umbrella in the opening monologue. Its quipping action-star interpretation of returning hero Leon might as well be a different person. It dropped virus-infected zombies for parasite-infected humans, and it traded all of the gameplay tropes it helped establish for something completely fresh. It's such a wild departure that it's still discussed amongst Resident Evil fans today for how it boldly cleaned the slate, for better or for worse. This aside, there's no arguing that it saved the series from stagnation and changed gaming forever with its at the time innovative over-the-shoulder panic horror action. Number 4, Uncharted Drake's Fortune 2007 to Uncharted 2 Among Thieves 2009. They can't all be immediately obvious leaps and bounds. Sometimes it's fun to get a little more granular. When it comes to refining an idea and learning from experiences, the first 2 Uncharted games are a brilliant example of iterating a sequel within the same console space. Aesthetically, despite just 2 years between them, there's quite a strong difference between the first 2 Uncharted games, especially when it comes to character models. Obviously, Naughty Dog already had plenty to build from and had experience working within the PS3's tech at this point, a console that was notoriously hard to develop for, so plenty of time was spent turning the flat-faced action figures of Uncharted into more detailed and more handsomely chiseled characters. This really helps the improved script to land as well. But it's not just about graphics, sequels can be about finding one's feet. Whereas the original Uncharted was a decent if repetitive cover shooter, Among Thieves saw the series become the video game action movie hybrid spectacle that it became known as. The sequel does an infinitely better job of pacing shooting galleries and climbing sections, and features some of the best set pieces in the series, including the train shootout with its impressively immersive looping background. Uncharted 2 is what made Nathan Drake the Sony mascot he became for the next decade. Number 3, Kid Icarus of Myths and Monsters 1991 to Kid Icarus Uprising 2012. Any series that manages to skip 20 years of console revolution is going to look different, but one of the best examples of this is the unlikely revival of Kid Icarus. And unlikely is a very deliberate choice of wording here. Despite the 1986 original being quite unanimously held in high regard as an underrated gem for the NES, it took 5 years for the game to get a sequel. Of Myths and Monsters for the Nintendo Game Boy, strangely only released in America in 1991 and Europe in 1992, and never came to its home country of Japan, until the 3DS, but that's besides the point. However, with the main character Pit being drafted into the roster of Super Smash Bros. Brawl in the late 2000s, interest in Kid Icarus began to pick up again. In the 20 years of absence, the video game space had changed as dramatically as Pit's original original squat design had to his new Bishonen anime protagonist style. As such, 2012's Kid Icarus Uprising was a totally different take on the series, swapping 2D platforming for third-person shooting that utilised the stereoscopic 3D of the then new Nintendo 3DS. The game actually takes a few pot shots at the time the series spent dormant, yet despite decent sales and strong reviews, it's now been another decade without Pit and friends. Number 2, Final Fantasy VI 1994 to Final Fantasy VII 1997. It would have been easy to fill this list with franchises that made the most obvious graphical jump in game history, from 2D to 3D, but few reached the heights of Final Fantasy's transformation. Final Fantasy VI had pushed the Super Nintendo as far as it could go. The game's map, or 2 technically, which in itself was a shocking feat, was full of secrets and optional bosses. The story and characters were brilliantly animated in a way that felt epic for the time, but this was nothing compared to what would come in just 3 years. Final Fantasy VII wasn't just jumping to the CD-ROM-fed PlayStation, but had a whopping $45 million budget, making it one of the most expensive video games ever made at that point. This also made it an unavoidable must-play, taking the franchise to the worldwide stage in a big way. After the West had only gotten the sporadic FF game, usually numbered incorrectly, Final Fantasy VII was the launching point for the series globally. The huge game, split across 4 discs, boasted an entire suite of 3D work from overworld models, dozens of battle character models and animations, and more CGI than any other game to that point. Pairing this with fully orchestrated music made for a game that, whilst perhaps quaint now, had to be experienced to be believed at the time. Pretty good for a series 7 entries in. And number 1, every Elder Scrolls game. With some of the longest running franchises in gaming, it's possible to track the changes in the industry incrementally through new installments. On the flip side, Elder Scrolls games tend to be so infrequently released that each one feels like a completely fresh experience, so to just pick one pair would be impossible. Perhaps the outlier to this is the 2 years between the original game, Arena, and its sequel, Daggerfall. Whilst this is therefore also the smallest jump in quality, it's very clear that the Bethesda team had learnt a lot on their first RPG and applied that experience to every facet of its sequel, creating a bigger, prettier, and more active map to explore. Morrowind arrived 6 years later, following the real advent of 3D gaming, being the first entry to come to Xbox and doing so in stunning fashion as the most impressive RPG on consoles at the time. Whilst the map this time is technically smaller, with a lack of procedural generation, it makes for a more considered world to get lost in. 4 years later, Oblivion added an unprecedented physics system to Elder Scrolls, as well as HDR lighting and a spectacular draw distance. 5 years on marked the most recent mainline entry with Skyrim, which improved lighting, shadows, and weather effects greatly, and it also added a greater degree of verticality to Tamriel, making for some pretty impressive views. If Elder Scrolls 6 arrived in 2025, and that's probably being generous, that would be almost 15 years since Skyrim, and thus would continue the trend. And considering that Skyrim's original launch in 2011 wasn't even natively in HD, it's fair to say we've come a long way since. So goodness only knows what Elder Scrolls 6 will look like.